All right, good morning to all, and welcome to session 2 of our Saint Macrina Centre seminar on Saint Gregory of Nyssa's work on the soul and the resurrection. It's a dialogue between Gregory and Macrina, his sister. Now, the title of this seminar is The Authority of Our Gift of Life. So we're still thinking of authority, we're thinking of gift, and we're thinking of life. Those are the threads throughout the whole thing. Yesterday, we talked about hearing a word from tradition. We're reading this text to hear a word from tradition. And also, that's why Gregory goes to Macrina, to hear a word from tradition. We're trying to hear a word, which means this seminar then demands something of us. It demands our close attentiveness within the seminar. We're moving quickly, day by day, through a very rich work. And yet we want to attend to it. So we want to read closely, look at the actual way that Macrina and Gregory phrase their thinking. And then we want to think closely, not wander into, let's say, opinion or abstract notions, but thinking closely about the meaning of these phrases, these terms, these words for us. And in this seminar, we want to enter into what we can call close dialogue, to listen carefully to each other and respond out of what the other person said, not just proceed with our. So this attentiveness, which is throughout, is demanding and it's important. This means sometimes that one of us will maybe bring to the table something that we wrote 25 minutes ago because we're thinking together. So this is ferment too. It's a kind of form or lived form of what we're reading about, dialogue. We're doing what Gregory and Macrina did and what many others have done in tradition. Come together and try to understand something of the gift of life. Now, last time we just to remind us of a couple of the features of last time. We talked a bit about tonality. We wondered about the tonality, not only of Gregory and Macrina's phrasing, but the work on the whole. We emphasized the metaphysical truth of the incarnation, the logos become flesh. That's central. We also we're careful about the tendency to conclude about life or death in this way. Conclusion in thinking becomes a kind of identity, a kind of still life. Macrina cautions us against too simple conclusion by pointing to the mystery of things too, that as much is revealed, also is hidden, especially in the incarnation. Maximus makes this point too. The revelation is only equaled by the gift that is fullness still to come. And we also wandered about a few ways of phrasing the idea of communion, or not the idea of communion, because it's not an idea, it's a part of us, it's our reality. And so David offered a couple of ways of thinking about communion, and that's good. We want to begin phrasing things in our minds and wondering, saying it that way, how does that land? What does it mean to say it that way? Right. We asked one question at the end of last time, or for last session, which we didn't actually consider to some extent, and so I want to begin there. The question was, how does Gregory's sense of integrity inform how we ask our own questions, how we think? How does the sense of integrity, of integral being that comes out of this text via Macrina and Gregory, how does that change our thinking? What does it mean to try to understand what we're talking about? Well, one thing we noted yesterday was that when we begin to think in terms of integrity, the question, what do we mean by death, the word death, and what do we mean by the word resurrection, become more immediately complex. We hold our tongue rather than spin off a phrase in response. But we know that when death and resurrection, or we know that they are often considered in terms of time, or in terms of our mortality. And yet we're questioning our own comprehension of time, what temporality means for us. We also saw that Gregory and Macrina are mostly interested in a kind of movement, the movement of the person, the movement of the divine. In that passage we read out yesterday, we called it a monadic phrasing. I mean, it was the deity phrased in singular terms, but it was in constant movement, constant circular movement. That was the image we're given. Integrity, disintegrity, movements, that's a different question than the question of substance, right? Of definition. And so we might say, we're not trying to define a substance so much, or think in terms of substance or essence. We are trying to phrase meaning within our given horizon. Meaning within our given horizon depends on assumed terms of reference and also the formation of our thinking and our being, our own inner formation. So let's begin to look at part of the horizon of this text. I'm going to read that we won't close read, but you can turn if you have the text to page 50. It's not in the chat, alas, page 50 and 51, just very briefly. We have 3 hermeneutical moves quickly, 1 on 50, 2 on 51, that let us know that Gregory and Macrina are very aware of how they're saying things and the horizon within which we may find meaning here. Midway down 50, Macrina says, for us, if the truth could be sufficiently demonstrated by the secular philosophy, which has discoursed skillfully concerning these faculties, it would perhaps be superfluous to add a discussion of the soul to our investigation. What do we note immediately there? First of all, she is saying that the stance that they're assuming is distinct, is different. But moreover, she's saying, unless something needs to be said, why would we say it? If it already is a truth that we're living, why would we say it? And we talked yesterday about as it were, the ecstasies of the saints. We use that term, but all that we mean is singularity or extraordinary things in the faith. And we said, extraordinary is not. It's not very legitimate within our tradition. And there's no special knowledge only for some, it's for everybody. And in the same way, Macrina is saying, other people have truth. We'll listen to their truth. Then on 51, this is partway down the only full paragraph. Macrina says, and what we're doing is not philosophical dialectic. It's not dialect. You know, Bakhtin calls dialectic dialogue robbed of flesh and voice and vitality. But here on page 51, Macrina says, everyone knows that dialectical elaboration has equal power on both sides to overturn the truth and to accuse falsehood. Hence, we are often suspicious of the truth itself if it is presented with this kind of art, as if such cleverness might mislead our mind and deceive it of the truth. So she's saying, our ideas are, first of all, not meant to be understood as our singular own, right? They're part of the tradition. But we have to be very wary about how we schematize things, how we say, figure our ideas or configure our ideas, what shape we seem to take in our minds. And then on the top of 51, Macrina just says, we should consider nothing peculiar to the soul, which is not also proper to the divine nature. We should consider nothing peculiar to the soul, which is not also proper to the divine nature. So, what do we learn here? The approach here is to stand more deeply within, not stand out uniquely, first of all. Second of all, we have to be very wary of what kind of formation or figuration we give our ideas in the world, how we relate them with other people. And third, we learn that the center of our meaning is something shared with the divine. Whatever we can call our own meaning somehow reflects or reveals our sense of the divine too. And so we gather ways of phrasing meaning. We gather ways of phrasing meaning within our horizon. That's what aphorism means. It means what is gathered from the horizon of thoughts. Aphorism. So we're looking for aphorisms rather than definitions, let's say, or theoretical statements. We're looking for how the meaning, which is lived by us within this given horizon, is phrased in relation with other people. And remember, phrase is like a musical phrase. It's a linking with beauty. That's what the phrase meaning is. It means to link in terms of beauty. Talking of horizon and compass then. If we're phrasing meaning within our horizon is formed by the extent of our discernment. It's as far as we can discern. It's as far as we extend. And our compass then, within that horizon, is both measure and directedness of energy. So the compass points the way to the center of energy, but it also measures. To compass something means to measure it. This is on page 56. I'll read the whole sentence so we don't have to turn if we don't want to. Macrina says our horizon is humanity. She says humanity encompasses every form of life. Humanity encompasses every form of life. That's on page 56 at the top. We've seen this represented or expressed before in terms of the human being, the man, the person as microcosm, right? That's the image that we're given at towards the end of the chapter we looked at yesterday. Humanity encompasses every form of life. This is also a teaching about the logos become flesh. The logos become flesh. So that's a horizon. Our compass within that horizon, our sense of directedness or energy, arises from the divine gift of intimate communion, the form of being that that is revealed to be holy. Our integral presence in loving relation with another person. That's our compass, not our own ideas. An intimate communion or integral presence in loving relation. And how we proceed with others, trying to love, trying to be present, trying to understand, trying to forgive, all of the things that we're asked. We have to be very careful about, let's say, assuming about the world, assuming it is or it is not this way or that way. We saw yesterday how thinking in terms of mortal time can result in us leaning on the categories of is and is not at the center of our epistemology. We have to be very careful. Macrina has already deepened this question, or Macrina and Gregory, by making it at least partly about perception. And so when we talk about the world, we say it is this, or it is that, or it is not this, or it is not that. We have to be careful because how we're phrasing it is how we're joining with it, and we're completing it in our own sense. All right, 2 cautions from Macrina on this. First of all, on the top of page 57, she says, by the particular use of our free choice such impulses of the soul become instruments of virtue or wickedness. By the particular use of our free choice, such impulses of the soul become instruments of virtue or wickedness. So, first of all, our perception is intimately formed by the freedom of our appropriation, the freedom of our integral movements. So our perception is intimately formed by how we draw into our own. And then on page 59, also at the top, she says, I'm beginning in the middle of a phrase. Sometimes that which alone is truly good by nature has also been overshadowed by the plant of deceit growing along with it. Sometimes that which alone is truly good by nature has also been overshadowed by the plant of deceit growing up along with it. So we not only see that how we understand gathering or intimacy shapes our perception, but also we might be deceived. We might be mistaken in our perception. In other words, we might be relating in a way which doesn't do justice or honor to the integral holiness of the thing that we meet. We also note here that deceit is different than hiddenness. And so when we were talking yesterday and ongoingly about truth and hiddenness, we're not talking about truth and falsity. It's something else. We asked, what does hidden mean? And we varied in our responses, but it doesn't mean deceit. It doesn't mean wrong. It doesn't mean false. We know that. Mistakenness. Now, our perception is part of our response to the world. Our response to the world. And we respond via we called it transparent perception yesterday. There's things going on there. Via our transparent perception, out of the authority of the gift of our being, which is understood as a communion with God. The gift of our being is understood as a form of communion with God. So our perception proceeds as part of this response, but we're responding to something given. We're given, and the gift has us in mind, as it were. It's a particular gift from the divine. And so in a way, our response could be also understood, perhaps better understood, as co-responding. Co-responding. It's not a one-way thing. There's activity on both sides, as it were. Co-responding. This is also figured in the term synergy, what we mean by synergy. Now, our response is always full of movement, the movements of the soul. In the desert fathers and mothers, the great demons of noonday, as they say, are inertia and indifference, putting stuff off to tomorrow. The monks say tomorrow is of the devil's vocabulary. So we're in constant movement, constant drawing near. And to whom are we drawing near? We're drawing near to Christ as the fullness of our horizon. Christ as the fullness of our horizon. That fullness, though, we'll return to this word fullness, that fullness can include hiddenness, as we said. Now, we're drawn near to Christ as the fullness of our horizon. And yet, we are composite beings, and we're taught that the divine is simple. We'll pose this as a question after, but just for now, we can think, God knows and loves us via our own integral being. And yet our own integral being, which is of God, it's a gift, is composite, it's gathered, it's integral. So what does integrity have to do with simplicity? That's one of the questions we can ask. All right, so that's by way of opening remarks. Just to give a brief kind of overview of each chapter and then walking into some of the text. There are four bits of the work we'll look at today, and we have 3 questions. And I'd like us to apply our questions to the works themselves. We'll begin in reading the work. But let's turn to the text now. We're looking at chapters 3 and 4 of On the Soul and the Resurrection. Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is titled, I think it's an English title. I'm not sure if there are titles in other versions of the text. Chapter 3 is about the emotions, about emotion, right? Now we know emotion is not to be dismissed. Emotions prove the movement of our inherent in our cast of mind. But we can say that emotions qualify the tonality of how we phrase meaning. Emotions qualify the tone of our voice in relation with others. And then chapter 4 is on the condition. It says condition. Condition here, I think what is meant are ontological, as it were, or topological inquiries, rather than to actually try to figure the soul after death, as if we can cast an image of that. I think what Gregory and Macrina are going for here is ontological or topological, perhaps, ideas. And then just anticipating the chapter for tomorrow, which is on recognition. Recognition enters into our consideration here today too. But recognition means to bless and confirm as part of one's own integral being. We recognize something, we bless and confirm it as part of our own integral being. Okay, with that in mind, let's turn to page 52, please. If you're following in the chat, it should be the first images, I hope. 52, the bottom of 52 over to page 53. And as with yesterday, we'll read out these sections, these extracts. I will offer a few comments for us to hold in mind, to return to, and then we'll return to them all together. This is 52 towards the bottom, beginning, do you see, that full paragraph. Do you see, she asked, that reason, the logos, conflicts with these faculties and yearns for the soul to be stripped of them as far as possible? And indeed, there are some for whom this yearning has been fulfilled, as we hear in the case of Moses, that he was superior to anger and desire. The narrative testifies about him, both that he was very meek, more than all men. It shows his peaceableness and his freedom from anger by his meekness. And that he did not desire any of those things with which we see the desiring faculty concerned in most men. It's talking about the compass, the directedness of energy. This would not have happened if these faculties were part of our nature and were referred to the principle of our essence. For it is not possible for one who has gone outside his nature to remain in being. But Moses was in being, and yet was without these. Therefore, these are something besides our nature, and not our nature itself. For the true nature is that which contains the being of the essence. But we can separate ourselves from these in such a way that their disappearance is not only harmless, but even beneficial to our nature. So obviously they are external, not of our own. They are external, things which happen to our nature and do not belong to its essence. For the essence is what our nature is essentially. That's, I'm sure, better in Greek, that last line. All right, what do we have here with this first set of books? We have we have, first of all, we have an image of the perfection involved in the fulfillment of movements. We have an image here of the perfection, the wholeness involved in the fulfillment of movement. We also see how meekness becomes authority, a form of authority or authoritativeness. You can ponder that. Also in this section, we see that our gift of being, our being, extends beyond our horizon, beyond our comprehension. Our gift of being is beyond the horizon of our own thinking. It's a gift which we will never see the end of. Macrina asks here too, what belongs to our nature, or to our soul, or to our person? What belongs to us, with us? And how does what belongs to us, how is that transformed? So, some thoughts, and we'll move on to the next section to read, but we want to return to each of these as we please. Michael, could I ask you to read a little bit, please? Page 54 to 55. This should be the next two images in the chat if you're following that way. The full paragraph beginning on page 54, my teacher said, and then just over to the end of that paragraph, in order to criticize, please. Michael, you're muted.
My teacher said, I myself was probably responsible for this confusion of reasoning because I did not make distinctions in the discussion of this matter, which would give some logical order to our consideration. So now, as well as I can, I will devise an order for the investigation so that as we consider the subject in logical order, we may leave no room for such objections. I say that the powers of contemplation, judgment, and vision of reality are proper and natural to our soul, and that the soul keeps in itself, through these powers, the image of the divine grace. Since also our reasoning conjectures that the divine, whatever it is in its own nature, is in these faculties at any rate, in the oversight of everything and the discrimination between the good and the worst. But whatever faculties lie on the boundary of the soul, inclining in opposite directions according to their own nature, which, depending on their usage, have a good or evil outcome, such as anger or fear or whatever of this kind is among the impulses of the soul, without which we cannot imagine human nature. We judge that these things have become attached to the soul from outside because no such mark appears on the archetypal beauty. Only so far let our discussion concerning these be set forth as if in a lecture hall, so that it may avoid the abuse of those who listen in order to criticize.
Thank you, Mike. That's a great last sentence, huh? Those who listen in order to criticize. That's what the opposite of what we're trying to do here. All right, some thoughts on this. So this passage it touches the idea of the likeness of our soul, what's termed the soul, the likeness of our soul to God. That's part of what's going on here. It's also about the boundaries, as it were, or the horizon of our person, of our soul, and the encounters that occur there, the encounters that occur on the horizon of our soul. But in order for encounter to happen, we need to comprehend, and this is also in this passage, what belongs within the horizon of our integral being. What belongs? What does belong to the soul mean? How may we phrase, how may we put into beautiful form that with which we are intimately conjoined without defining it? Also, there's a sense that a significant encounter, not all significant encounter, but significant encounter happens at the limits of our horizon, as it were, where we end and meet another. Thanks. The limits of our horizon. That moment of encounter, that topography of encounter and response is what's being addressed here. Okay, just to, and again, we can return to these passages, but to move on to the next, read out the next. Carrie, would you mind reading a little bit, please? This is just, and this should be the next set of images if you're following in the chat. Page 59 through 60, beginning with about 8 lines up, 10 lines up, or if love is taken away, just through to the end of that chapter, when they become passions and are named accordingly, please.
Absolutely. Okay. Or if love is taken away, in what matter will we be joined with the divine? If anger is quenched, what weapon will we have against our adversary? So you see, the farmer leaves the bastard seeds in us, intending not that they should permanently dominate the more honorable sowing, but that the field itself, for he figuratively names the heart, through the natural power residing in it, which is reason, should dry up one part of the plants, but render the other part fruitful and thriving. But if this does not happen, he assigns to the fire the task of sorting out the harvest. Just getting the other one here, sorry. Sorry, that's page 60. He would be like some king who, by using the many hands of his servants for assistance, will easily accomplish the virtuous purpose. If, however, as when slaves revolt against their owner, he falls into the power of his emotions and is enslaved by him, succumbing ignobly to servile mindlessness, so that he becomes a puppet of those impulses by which by nature are subjected to him, he will be drawn inevitably to those actions to which he is forced by the domination of the passions which control him. If this is true, we shall declare that these emotions are neither virtuous nor wicked in themselves, since they are impulses of the soul which lie in the power of the users to serve good or otherwise. When their movement is toward the better, we shall declare they are material for praise, as desire was for Daniel, anger for Phineas, and grief for the one who mourns rightfully. If, on the other hand, their inclination is towards the worse, then they become passions and are named accordingly.
Thank you kindly. Lovely. What do we read here? There's some vivid images here, which means we have to take care. Anytime there's a vivid image, we have to take care. Well, first of all, the self is understood in terms of movement. The person is understood in terms of movements. So Macrina is saying here, or Macrina and Gregory are their stance here, is that we cannot understand the self beyond movement. That's very important, extremely important. Also, there is the question of, I'm not sure what the noun is, of the bastard, of bastardom, maybe? Or to put it another way, coming at it from a slightly different angle, usurper. Usurper. A bastard or a usurper is one who assumes a position but neglecting the question of inward formation. This is a form of deception that Macrina was talking about earlier. And grandly, it's our understanding of the Antichrist. Something stands in illegitimately for something else. So it's a very deep metaphor. There might be something there. The images of harvest and fire here. We could ask, to what end? To what end? Why this image? It's a curious image. I don't know what to do with it, but the images of fire and harvest. And then just a kind of broad point. We realize that there's a gift at the foundation of our existence, not nothing. We're given things. We don't begin from nothing and then add everything to us. We're given something, and our life is spent trying to complete that gift in relation with others. All right. So a few thoughts just there. Let's turn to our final reading. David, would you mind reading a bit, please, from the nearly the whole of 64, just the top paragraph, or on page 64, beginning partway through that line, for it is believed, just to the end of that chapter, please. David, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I realize that.
Oh.
I'm sorry. Beginning where?
Pardon me, page 64, in the first line, you can just begin, for it is believed.
Okay.
Or anywhere in the first line. Thank you.
Let me begin just with the beginning of that sentence on 63. Or if indeed any other nature besides those mentioned is imagined to exist among the rational beings, which one might wish to name either demons or spirits or anything else of the sort, we will not differ, for it is believed both from the common notions and from the tradition of the scripture that there is some nature outside of bodies like ours, opposed to the good and harmful to human life, which has voluntarily fallen away from the better position, and in rebellion from the good gives substance to that which is conceived as its opposite. Some say that the apostle counts this demonic nature among the subterranean beings, some say, signifying in that passage that when evil is finally obliterated by the long cycles of the ages, nothing outside of the good will remain, but the confession of Christ's lordship will be unanimous, even from the demons. Therefore, no one could force us any longer by the name of subterranean beings to imagine a place under the earth, especially since we understand that the air is evenly wrapped around the earth everywhere, so that no part of the earth lacks the mantle of air.
Thank you. This is one of the sections which is most on fire, and so we approach it gently, carefully. Two aphorisms we might glean from this horizon. First, I think that well, first of all, Macrina / Gregory are being careful here. They do this throughout, but they're being careful again. This is not my individual word. It's not my idea. It's not something that I know, but no one else knows. So she begins, well, at the top of 64, we will not differ, for it is believed both from, this is a gathered form of meaning. And then she says, some say that the apostle, right? She's relating truths of the tradition, not different in ethos than the rest of what she's saying, but she is marking it off rhetorically, deliberately, in order to not make it a private vision, I think. So the first thing that we can note is that synergy, our very being, is neither defined nor confined by our tendency to reduce ourselves to mortality. So synergy is neither defined nor confined by our tendency to reduce our being to temporality, mortal temporality. That's first. Synergy is not just chosen. It's not something which we direct or own. Second, and this is the deeper question, I think, for all who wander into this area, how is conclusion beyond time possible? What kind of passion do we have in ourselves, intellectual passion, to believe that we can conclude beyond time? In other words, why this temptation towards certainty? Why do we want to declare about what happens after time ends? Macrina is not tempted by this. We are. So back to conclusion. Now, those are the four passages. Let's begin. Let's open it up. We've gone on here. I want to reiterate the three questions, though, that I sent out yesterday. And let's begin by applying them to some part of what we've discussed or some part of the work. Right? The first question, if you recall, is about the relation between wholeness and completion and fullness. Right? If our created being is whole in its genesis, and it is, there's no ontological lack in us. Its fullness is found in the divine. But our existence is spent trying to, as it were, complete the gift in ourselves. Firm up, make stronger and healthier the synergy in which we are and live and move. So what is our task with others? Our being is whole. It finds its fullness in the divine. What are we doing with other people? We're not just confirming their existence or telling them to think in a right way. What are we doing? Second question, a little bit different. Do our notions of freedom and choice depend on time? Do our notions of freedom and choice depend on time? That is, are they to be thought only and necessarily within the horizon of time? Freedom is the deeper question. Because choice proceeds from freedom. Is there freedom beyond time? If that makes sense, is not nonsensical. The third question. Oh, we asked this already. If our being is competent, is integral, and divine being is simple, beyond integrity, how do we understand our drawing near? What does it mean to draw near with our integrity? What relation does integrity have with simplicity? So those are the questions. Let's open it up though now, beginning with any one of those we wish, or circling back to the passage. Let's begin talking together.
I wouldn't mind circling back to the passage that I read. I noticed in the footnotes,
Please, go on.
in the footnotes there, where there's a kind of readerly tension. Often the text is in some ways, even being sort of brought up short, and it kind of reflects on this tension between Greek thought and what have you, and it continuously reminds us of that connection. Interestingly enough, is it the translator who provides the footnotes, or is that an editor?
I think they're the same.
So Roth then he reminds us that he puts it, that Genesis is being configured in terms of Aristotle's notion of the soul, and that strikes me as a slightly uncharitable way of putting it. I mean, there doesn't seem to, this is kind of either or. I mean, I'm not rejecting what I was suggesting last week, but it seems to me that there are many interesting intersections between Hebraic and Greek thought, and some of them are quite wholesome in a way. And I don't think there's anything out of keeping in Aristotle's notion of a rational soul with the notion in Genesis of humans, after all, being, made flesh. And but Roth misses an interesting point that is really quite striking. I can't remember the exact book, but late in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explicitly makes the identical point that Macrina is making when she is making this distinction between various emotions and what have you, and what is really essential about us. And Aristotle follows the same methodological procedure of saying, well, what would the gods do? And he eliminates all sorts of transactional and kind of emotionally laden activities. And he says that the only form of energeia that would make sense among the gods would be precisely Macrina's definition that I was surprised to see when I read it out in that passage, namely that the highest activity, the activity that counts as kind of eudaimonia for humans, the highest good is living life in accordance with, as the gods would, contemplation, and through our rational agency. And so that's quite a striking declaration. And it's not any worse because Aristotle was also, this isn't a blaspheming moment, also filled with the Holy Spirit. I think to deny that is really kind of absurd. And it connects with the passage which Kiri read about the relation between the passions and reason. And we have a complete reversal in, sorry, I'm going on a little bit, so I'll try to wrap this up quickly, but I think it's a useful kind of bracketing Aristotle and Hume. Hume gives us a desiccated view of reason when he says that reason, it's a bewildering passage, but it's quite telling, kind of a positivist anthem. Reason is and ought to be, how strange is that? Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. He obviously has a notion of reason. It's more calculative than substantial, and it's bereft of any sense of the logos. So, and of course, the result is that we face another magnificent contribution of Hume's, a kind of one of those magnificent errors in a way that is almost impossible, which is impossible to resist from a naturalistic framework, namely the is-ought, because if reason is the slave of the passions, in other words, the passions have no aspect of the logos, they're utterly meaningless. You can't characterize them as good or bad or anything else. And this whole conversation of Macrina's would sort of dissolve, but with it would dissolve the very basis possibility, put it in a kind of Kantian formulation, the very possibility of morality. And I think that's those are the kind of stakes that Hume is providing for us. At best, we would have kind of a pleasure-based utilitarian view of morality, which is to say no intrinsic basis at all. Okay, but I know that's a lot to throw out there, but those are my initial thoughts.
I wouldn't mind riffing off that a little bit. And doubling down on what Michael's saying. One of the areas where I think very uncareful reading has happened is in this sort of imaginary Greek Hebrew dualism that I would trace back to von Harnack, and it's become super popular, as if the Jews hadn't already fully integrated Greek and Hebrew thought well before the time of Christ. And what ends up so you can end up reading backwards into this with what Michael called like very uncharitable, wherever you see signs of the Greek contribution, and then as if there's this purity code about stripping that away because it's somehow an infection, and it's just such a lack of care, I think. And then the other area is in terms of, well, and I should say this, Father John Bear posits that on the soul and the resurrection, not only the content, but the very structure, it may be, deliberately related to Plato's Timaeus or Phaedo. I forget which one, because he's doing a couple of these texts right now. So there's something purposeful about that that's meant to be helpful. And then the other is, I asked earlier about the Greek text of this because I'm always so suspicious about a Cartesian translation. So for example, logos is translated reason, and then they'll even do nous or noesis or noetic as intelligence. And it just pulls back in an anachronism on what Michael called the calculative that's not necessarily there in the text. So I guess I'm being quite negative, but about Cartesian readings and these dualistic readings that obscure what they're actually saying. And so, yeah, my overly negative contribution today. There you go.
If I may, first of all, Michael, it was nice to have you bring Aristotle close to us, because he's part of our tradition and our reading as well. And I also was delighted that you flagged that particular footnote, because it struck me several times, and Irene has just rung the changes on that, that the translator has a bit of an edge on, is coming from someplace. But that being said, we have the text as it's given to us in front of us, and we know some of these things, so I don't think we have to be overly exercised about it. But it's a good kind of corrective to have us keep that in mind as we consider the text. There's just a couple things that, if I may, to put on the table here at the beginning of the conversation. And one is a bit of a query and a question, given how Andrew shaped one of his remarks about on page related to the text on page 59. When Andrew, and I just want you to say a word more about this. When you spoke about our constantly drawing near to Christ as our horizon. So I'd just like you to unpack that a touch? Are you, and it's because of our habit of mind of, so often when we use the word Christ, we think of Jesus Christ. We think of, or some people are inclined to think of a historical figure. And I'm not saying that isn't the case. Don't get me wrong here, but is the meaning here drawing near to the presence of the incarnation? Drawing near to the presence of the incarnation. Is the meaning here drawing near to, or opening ourselves, attending to, responding to communion wherever it's found? Because that is the Christ moment. Can you just say a touch more about that?
I think you put that well. And your question yesterday, is the soul something? We could ask that question of whenever we tend to perhaps try to concentrate substance somewhere. Is it something or not? Drawing near is a rich metaphor, and we'll deepen it in the rest of the week even more. But drawing near, it also means to be drawn near. It's not just an activity in the face of passivity.
Yeah.
It's synergetic. I think that your caution here is true. We draw near. I used to say we draw near without identification. We seek to draw near without looking for sameness, as Macrina says in the reading yesterday. But in the terms here, we could say we draw near without the urge for conclusion, without the urge to say, this is it, because...
Or that it's something.
Or that it's something, yeah.
Yeah.
As Shakespeare said, whenever we say this is the worst is yet to come. We try to name something and think it's a thing over against. Or we can become, as you hint to, even more confused temporally and believe that what we are trying to do is either emulate or revere or recreate some kind of historical pattern of conduct that we identify with the incarnation.
Good, and if I may just raise one other area that's striking to me, and I'd be interested in people's response to it, because it brings us into the narratives of the Hebrew Bible. So first of all, just the first question that you ask: if our being is whole in its genesis, God said, and it is good. And ultimately finds its fulfillment or fullness in the divine embrace, which has no end. How are we to understand our task of completing the gift of our own personal being in community with others? So I just want to rub that question up against the text on page 60, and these three figures that she offers to us, these three texts, the first one being Daniel, the second one being Phineas, and the third one, to bring us also to recall a little bit from yesterday, being Gregory, or so it seems to me. So first of all, she's talking about desire and anger, these emotions. And I'd be interested in the way the rest of you think about this. I've swum around or paddled around. I'm not a very good swimmer. Us Norwegians don't swim, nor do the Icelanders, by the way, Kendra, I'm sure. because we know the ocean is a dangerous place. So we've got enough trouble trying to survive it in a boat. But I paddle around in these texts now for quite a long time. And it's always struck me that, given the translations of them, that there's this, what can easily be seen as confusion between what I would call desire, being natural, what is given to us in our being, and appetite, which is the way in which, that odd way in which a natural desire can become inflated and can colonize our being. So I think when we read the word desire here, and we can think, I think, appetite. In any case, that's maybe my own preoccupation. So this first figure, Daniel, I'll just a word about him, and then a word about Phineas, and a word about Gregory related to what's said. So what struck me when I read it, and I haven't read the Daniel narrative for quite a while, and I know that all of you probably read it this week. But as a little boy reading this, having this text read to me, it was striking to me, even when I was young, that someone faced with their own death in the arena, that lovely word, which of course means field of blood, faced with the lion, is himself sanguine. Odd, huh? How those words dance together. That is, Daniel, at least I think the reason it's referenced here, is that Daniel's whole disposition in that context is a disposition of being attentive, not to what he assumes is going to occur, or what the effort is to have happen here, but he is simply present to what is unfolding as in God, as in the mystery beyond all mysteries. So I'd be interested in how you see this reference to Daniel, any of you. The second one, Phineas, anger. Well, first of all, Daniel in that sense has no appetite. He's not presuming. He has holy desire, which is another word for presence, God in that sense. So then Phineas. So this is a figure about which I have never given any thought to in the past, but it's interesting that, to my mind, that Phineas is the son of Eleazar and the grandson of Aaron, and an ancestor of Ezra. And Ezra is so significant in Jewish understanding, because Ezra is where we get the holiness code, as opposed to the code of the covenant or the code of Deuteronomy. That is the code in the Hebrew Bible, which is all about holiness. It's all about a transformation of your mind and your heart. It's not about living up to something. It's about opening yourself to something. And the text, which the text sort of celebrates his zeal, the biblical text. And it's associated with this Israelite who was having intercourse with a Midianite woman. This is a pretty raw text. And it's done in terms of the rites of Baal, that it's ritual. It's an It's an act of worship of something, offering to something. And that something is a pretty dramatic deity, pretty dramatic demon. And it says that Phineas killed both with a single stroke, a spear. And it even goes on, the Bible is so raw. In Numbers 25, says that the spear went through the genital organs of both of them. This is awful stuff. And that the result of this is that it provides an abiding priesthood. So, anger here, anger. What is anger? It arises from an encounter with recognizing something that is meant for communion, something that is Eucharistic, that is used for something in which there is no communion, in which there is only bloodlust. So it's a form of idolatry. So for Macrina and for Gregory to place this narrative there around the notion of anger is also, it seems to me, and I'm interested in your thoughts on it, it seems to me it's saying, anger is also a natural response, which gets turned into an appetite. But here is a narrative about it as a holy response, not in any way because she and he do not do this, and the spiritual fathers of the Orthodox tradition don't turn this into something other than what they make of it. What they're making of it is not the narrative. This awful narrative is about an inner struggle. It's about the inner struggle when we, as so much is made out of this, when we, when our thoughts and our orientation to the life of the world is engaged in a confusion between that which opens up as communion in thanksgiving and where that which could open that way is colonized and used and redirected towards some presumption. So there's a spiritual dimension to this, which the fathers and mothers of the church make use of to speak on the one hand of, yes, anger it's telling you something. It's your conscience speaking to you about something that happens within your inner life. And then thirdly, grief. And here it's so simple, and she doesn't mention his name. But of course, this is in the narrative, the central reason for this conversation, where she talks about appropriate grief. And yesterday, we made the distinction between around her question that opens up this whole text. Why, Gregory, do you resent death? And here we have her saying, Gregory, you just think you resent death. This is appropriate grief that's emerged. So desire, or I would call it appetite, anger, and appropriate grief, they all have their shadow, but they all have the possibility of speaking to the transfiguration of our life and speaking to the reality, which is and always is and only is communion.
Thank you, David. I loved these two chapters. For those of you who don't know, I'm a psychologist, and so I work with emotion every day. And I was quite struck by how much in these passages is still relevant to much of psychology today. But what you were saying, David, about being attentive to what is unfolding in Daniel, or with Phineas and anger, or with grief, it's that we often talk about emotional regulation in psychology, or I think an important piece of wisdom is knowing the proper proportion. What is the right proportion of fear in the situation or anger in the situation? Too much fear can paralyze us. Too little fear can get us killed, but the right amount of fear can help us respond appropriately. Or often anger is a boundary setting emotion. Anger says no. Anger protests what is unjust. Too much anger can be aggressive. Too little can be passive, but the right amount can be assertive, can bring out the good. And so I think in response to that first question about what's our task of completing the gift of our personal being in community with others, or the sense of wholeness and integrity, or our composite beings, is that it's just all dialogical. It's whether it's couples counseling and trying to facilitate a dialogue in there, or it's so many psychological theories are trying to help parts of the brain that don't normally talk to each other. The dialogical self, like you said, listening to what is anger saying? What is this anger telling me? What is this fear telling me? And I love how this book is a dialogue between Gregory and Macrina, and how Gregory pushes back about emotion, and Macrina kind of humorously says, well, maybe I wasn't being clear. And so it's what you said before, David, as the kingdom of God is presence in communion. I think our task of completing the gift is exactly that, is like the between is the dialogue between that helps different people or different parts of ourselves talk to each other that don't normally talk to each other. And in psychology, whether that's EMDR therapy or emotion focused therapy or internal family systems, or what we're learning now about psychedelics, is that it's helping different parts of the brain talk to each other that have been isolated from each other. And that's a lot what trauma does. It isolates parts of ourselves from other parts. So this whole dialogue in the Socratic tradition and the early church tradition, I think, has so much to say for our time, and in the sense of what is our task to become whole as a community or as individuals. So
Great.
And if I may, I think as well, there is another therapeutic dimension in the text regarding the link between the image of God in man and emotions and passions and so on, because in one of the pages, Saint Macrina and Gregory refers to the parable of weeds and
Tares.
grain, and somehow compares the human being with the field, and makes us be careful what are the seeds that we cultivate in ourselves. It is there an ascetical dimension besides the psychological dimension that Jeremy emphasized. So to be aware of what kind of passion do we cultivate. And I think this is the beauty of the text, and one of the best parts of it, the fact that there is no evil passion. Depends on us. How do we transform the natural desire, the natural fear, the natural anger into something good? We see a bad anger which kills, for example, but we see a good anger, a holy anger, if we may call it this way. In the case of Jesus Christ, when he went in the court of the temple to expel the people who are doing business in God's house. So there is a good anger and the bad anger, the anger of killing a neighbor or so on. And what is interesting as well is the fact that somehow they suggest that these emotions do not belong naturally to the original constitution of the human being, to the image of God. And this, I think, it's a question mark, and I think it's a Platonic influence, because although they do not accept that the body is the jail or the tomb of the soul, although the mother and this church father tried to find something in the human nature which is not which is a characteristics of the human being after the fall of the paradise. And it is not very clear for me if the whole emotions of the human being are the consequence of the fall, or only the bad emotions. Yeah, it's something we may think about. And regarding the first question, if we are whole from the beginning, from our origin, what is our do we have still to work? Do we need to be in cooperation with other human beings or with God in order to fulfill our task as human beings? And maybe the answer is there in the text. As far as we try from all our heart to contemplate the supreme good, which is God, okay, a Neoplatonic thinking, and to cultivate good emotions, our likeness to God develops, and we really becomes not only in the image, but as well in the likeness of God. The image, paradoxically enough, for the human being, it's a given fact, and in the same time a duty, something to be discovered. It's not, it's something there hidden, not opposed to the truth, deep inside us. But so far as we don't cultivate the weeds, but the opposite, the good grain, we may discover ourselves as mirrors of God's, mirrors of the archetype of God, and reflecting his goodness. I think we may become small planets for our neighbors, and to show them the direction, to show them how a Christian can live a life in accordance with his own or her own intimate, true, deep nature created in the image of God, something like that. I read the text through this lens.
If I can just respond a little bit, Florin, I appreciate so much the way you you shape this and what some of the challenges are in it. So let me just draw this around to Andrew's second question, because I think it bears on it. Do our notions of freedom and choice depend on time? That is, are they thought only and necessarily through the horizon of time? So a couple of responses, Florin. When Saint Macrina speaks and our tradition speaks about how we are created whole, and we are the image of God. I wonder, is that a way of saying certainly when the text says in Genesis 3 that we are the image of God, we have to realize that this is this Jewish text where God has no image in the way of the surrounding tribes, no graven image. I think it's interesting that it uses that word in English too, graven image. That is an image which includes death. So in Jewish tradition, all the disciplines, the spiritual disciplines, and you really pointed at in your initial remark at something that's so important, which is the place of the asceticism in all of this. In the Jewish tradition, there's all these disciplines, as you know, to never name God. And every time you speak of Adonai, blessed be he, you are in a sense recognizing the emptiness there, which is also a complete fullness. But it's beyond our language. And the danger of idolatry is always to complete something. So it says in the text, human beings are made whole. The opposite of whole is complete. The opposite of whole is complete. Because whole, in this sense, includes movement. We are born into time. And if I understand this correctly, and you know this much better than I, because we are made to be co-creators of the world. So our wholeness includes our movement through time, but the danger is reducing what we perceive to time. I wonder if there isn't an element here of something similar or a similar comparison to the way in which we understand the presence of the kingdom of God, that all the cosmos, and you've written about this beautifully, all the cosmos is in the presence of the kingdom of God. But the presence is never complete. It's dynamic, it's unfolding, its glory is arising. So the presence of the kingdom of God, which is open to the fullness that is coming to greet us. So there's this element in it always of our freedom, as Andrew has shaped it here, depending on our choices in time, But the possibility there is for us to open not to the prejudices we have about what it means, or to the appetite to complete them in some form, colonize them, but rather to welcome the communion of all that arises, of all that addresses us. So just one response. Others may want to respond to you as well.
I think, yeah, please, Andrew.
I was going to comment a little bit differently. You go ahead, please, Tori.
Okay, thank you. I think with the second question regarding our notions of freedom and choice, depending on time, very subtly, Andrew actually pointed to the apokatastasis topic. Are we able, after the separation of soul from the body, to have freedom and choice beyond time? And what's the answer of Saint Gregory? Of course, I anticipate a little bit, and it's not very clear in this work, but everybody will finally recognize God's revelation and will naturally feel the need to enjoy it. The three levels, the angels, the human being, and even the demons, the sinners and the demons. So everybody will naturally it seems from the text that every rational being has this drive towards the supreme good, and finally God will reign in the whole of the creation as it has been in the beginning of the creation, because there is this play between beginning and end in Saint Gregory. And not only that, everything will be restored, but not only as it was in the beginning, but every human soul will be in a permanent epectasis, in a permanent progress towards knowing, loving better God as the supreme good of the human and generally rational existence. Okay, thank you. So this is the academic answer, but I think we may have more existential, if we may answer to what you asked there.
That's nicely put, Lorraine. That's nicely put. I think perhaps an illustration, perhaps, of the shift in mindset that you're talking about was given by Michael Burke earlier, when, seemingly casual comment, but extremely important to remember, that Aristotle had the Holy Spirit too. Each person does. We forget that. We say the divine permeates everything. The divine is everywhere present in all things. And every person is an image of Christ, and we are to love each other. Right up until we meet someone we don't agree with, or that is not in our tradition, and we think, what? No, but then if he's right, what does that do with me? And then we become that isolating that Jeremy talked about, you talked about a little bit, that kind of isolated sense of shoring up one's own security, one's own certainty. That seems to me to be the opposite of what we're getting at, as you put and as Michael put. But to bring it back to something that David said a bit ago. David, you used the carefully chosen term, appropriate grief, when you were talking about on page 16, that wonderful walkthrough, reminding us that it's not, again, we don't need to think in terms of is and is not. We need to think in terms of transfiguration, transformation. And that's happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere, and we're related to it. This is part of what the integrity of all creation means. This is part of what Gregory is insisting upon. It's not just happening in me and perhaps you, perhaps not, but I know it's happening in me. No, we have to think around that. Appropriate. Macrina uses the phrase "who mourns rightly," but I think that you've translated the sense much better with appropriate. Appropriate is that which belongs intimately with our own person, as appropriate, to bring into what is proper to ourselves. But our own, the gift of our being is from God. And so when we think of what is most deeply our inmost being, it's also a question of the divine. And the image of the divine we're given is of communion. And I think I'm just basically reiterating, rephrasing what you said, David, so beautifully. That which is appropriate to us is that which is open to communion, that which is present, as the term present that you use. Whenever we think of what belongs to us, it has to be belongs to us in relation with another person. So it belongs to them too. It belongs to that relation. It belongs to that movement. It's not about substance.
It's being in longing together. Yeah.
That's perfect. Belonging, being in longing together. And I like Florian, how you use the natural, that when time is exhausted, the natural desire or the natural urge for the creator will emerge more strongly from behind our deceptions, from behind our own self-deceits. That's really beautiful. Just to follow that, musing on something you brought up earlier, Michael, too, about the text itself. Irene, you brought up too. This text, I've crossed out about half of the footnotes on the text. It seems to me just wrong-headed often, not that well done. And I didn't say at the beginning, but I was going to counsel us not to read the introduction, just the text itself. I lament that we don't have the Greek too. It's too bad. But what's the point of a footnote? A footnote is meant to say, hey, look, this is vitally related with this other thing. This is of an integral meaning with this too. When it's done poorly, when that relation is done clumsily, as it is sometimes here, Michael, you pointed out one, it ruins that twofoldedness. It ruins the communion of the two things, the two people, two notions, two horizons. And so this idea of what is appropriate, what belongs in our movement of love and communion with another person, it's a broad hermeneutic question. But I like that Michael, what you brought up earlier also reminds us of this. We have to be careful if we see this with this, and we think this is a thing and this is a thing. Already the way in which we're trying to consider or comprehend is working in terms of is and is not and isolation. Pardon.
Just a quick, pretty quick comment. I was quite struck. It reminded me of a similar passage in Augustine when he's dealing with a multitude of interpretations that were prevalent of the opening verse of Genesis 1. And he handles it all quite delicately, keeping alive all sorts of seemingly incommensurate interpretations in light of current, at the time, science and what have you. And with Macrina, when she's dealing, and she juxtaposes scripture and common apprehension or common sense, let's say, talking about the afterlife and whether we should think of it in spatial terms. And it's remarkably it's a remarkably charitable moment. I mean, charity or openness is a hermeneutic principle, and it finds a striking formulation in Augustine when he kind of suggests, or a kind of version of the notion that we should try to make whatever we're apprehending come out true, and sometimes that's impossible. So you don't fret about the incidental. You try to get at what someone is, unbeknownst to them, apophatically trying to apprehend, and don't dwell on in a kind of I don't know, a way we're trying to subdue your enemy. So it's an instance of communion, as you say, and it's it's over a fairly significant issue. Can we spatially think about the afterlife? Sorry, that was supposed to be a brief comment. I kind of wandered off the edge a little bit, but yesterday, Kira, you treated us to a wonderful kind of meta encapsulation of a lot of our conversation. I've been sort of waiting on the edge of my seat for your intervention.
Oh, I don't know if I can what I can bring together. But I've loved everyone's comments. Thank you so much. I guess just a moment ago there, Michael, you were speaking about some sort of like fighting and wrestling. And if I was to relate that back slightly to, again, what David was saying about appropriate grief, and again, Andrew was kind of bringing up there, I think there's this wonderful comparison that obviously Macrina is bringing to the surface there between the appropriate grief and the resentment of death. And what I'm saying there regarding the fighting is that I think when you're in that place of resentment of death, that pulls you into this place where you're tempted to start trying to wrestle with that thing that you're resenting, right? There's a sort of fighting, a combat that leads to an exhaustion, and then to essentially an inertia, right? Which I guess if we were leaning back into what we were talking about yesterday, there's a huge difference between a life-giving movement and that place of exhaustion and kind of fixity, a frigid pause. So appropriate grief, I think, opens up this opportunity, which I think Jeremy spoke to so well, where he was speaking about, different interventions and ways of thinking about things. But appropriate grief, I think, speaks to a healing that calls us into this moving rest that allows for a restoration. So juxtaposing essentially this fighting and exhaustion, which leads to a pause, a frigid identity, versus this moving rest that can continue to enable us to connect in with the moving, like parousiaic kind of fullness, like of God, so that in Him we can continue to have being and continue to move in, through, and with our grief and beyond. So and as we were talking about all this kind of stuff, I like the last couple of comments, it was getting me thinking about the Zulus and this whole being in communion and how that's done in that place of being and belonging in communion both with God and others. So lots of different ideas kind of coming together there. But yeah, I love that appropriate grief versus resentment of death picture, and that's been coming up with Macrina in the various comments. So thank you. I don't know if anyone has anything to say or push back on it all.
Is he pushing back in terms of around movement, you know, like when I read, you know, I see him as an Origenist, and yet Origen seems to treat movement as this bad thing, right? It's and that we need to come to our rest. So do you sense Gregory's pushing back on that, or is he just talking in a different register?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I'm not sure. Obviously, Macrina is, I think, as I'm reading and understanding this, I'm kind of gathering that she's trying to push him into this appropriate grief, like mourning rightly, and then that ability to keep going and moving. And is he pushing back on that? Meaning that she has to kind of usher him in that direction. I'm not sure. What do you guys think?
The way you just said it helps me think about it in the context of grief as just something very practical, helping him not be stuck. Like
Right.
that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And opening up his soul to receive kind of pharisaically, like, you know, the fullness of God, like ushering him into more and not staying in that place of mourning forever and enclosing himself. I think I loved how Jeremy was talking about that isolation of trauma and even like compartmentalization, like kind of within the person that happens kind of in that place. And as I'm kind of reading this and thinking of this, it seems like Macrina's in a way is kind of shepherding towards that sort of integrated, both in the like personhood himself as well as like within community and with God, like pushing him towards that. That's how I kind of imagine this kind of almost pastoral discussion between Macrina and Gregory kind of happening. I don't know how accurate you guys feel that is.
Well, within that tradition, as it adds layer upon layer, as it gathers, all the way down to Zazulus and you and me, one of the images, I think I'll use the word images, is that of ever-moving repose, which is a way of trying to hold together. It's really a kind of existential play on the two natures of Jesus Christ. And Andrew flags that in his last question: if our being is composite, ever-moving, repose, and divine being is simple, how may we understand our drawing near to God? So I understand what you're suggesting, Aaron, about Origen, but I don't think that's, I mean, Origen was struggling with a whole pile of things. I think Zazulus is looking at some others, and certainly within our tradition, I guess I would maybe pose this as a kind of question that maybe we can keep in mind as we continue our reading. Is ever-moving repose simple? Is this the tradition's way of saying, yes, there is this movement? I go back to the references to Phineas and to Moses and to Gregory in the scriptural texts. we read those narratives are all about a movement and about a struggle. Certainly, Moses was given to appetite, and he killed an Egyptian in the narrative. He struck the rock, and for that, he did not enter the promised land. But he went up the mountain and fell asleep in the arms of Abraham. So the tradition, what Orthodoxy gathers, is not something. It's not a single picture. It's not about a single stage. Even if we speak about the 3 stages of the spiritual life as if it's purification, illumination, deification, it's never meant as a straight line or as isolated elements. It's a movement. And that movement is to the only simplicity that we can ever know, which is when we are given communion. And we usually don't know that in the normal sense of knowing in the moment. We recognize it afterwards sometimes. Ever-moving repose. That is drawing near to God. And when that communion arises, we are quiet.
I recall that expression used at least once in Maximus's Ambigua in the 2nd volume, and it might be useful to just so we can address your question maybe by email to provide a reference to at least one or more places where Maximus invoked that phrase, because I can't really summon the context exactly, but my guess, and this might be kind of more of a hope, which might say more about me than Maximus, is that there is no extinction of movement, and so the tension, by aligning it with repose, would be answered by a kind of simplicity that draws everything together. And so we wouldn't be conflating a naturalistic, relative, physicalist conception of time with the notion of another notion of change.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
But I'm on more typically compared to you, David, more kind of fragile speculative ground, and approaching a lot of these texts for the first time. So any references would be helpful to let your questions settle in.
This we might draw it to a close. This question of movement, or ever-moving repose, or stillness, peace, is throughout. We will not leave this behind, but we'll return to it in the next 3 days as well. Thank you all very much. I'm going to pause now.